the dust from the riders coming into Ellsworth. Kansas settled on Clara Louise's wedding dress like a filthy omen, and she knew in that moment her life was about to change in ways she could never have imagined. She stood on the porch of her father's mercantile, her hands gripping the wooden railing so hard her knuckles had gone white. The dress her mother had spent 6 months sewing hung on her frame like a shroud rather than a celebration, and the date circled on the calendar inside taunted her with its approach. 3 days. In 3 days, she would become Mrs. Montgomery Pierce, and the thought made her stomach turn with a fear so profound she sometimes forgot to breathe. The year was 1876, and Ellsworth had seen better days. Once a thriving cattle town, it still maintained a rough edge that kept respectable women indoors after dark and made men check their guns before stepping into the street. Clara had grown up here, watching her father build his business from nothing, watching her mother fade from consumption 2 years ago, watching the town transform from wild to merely dangerous. She had turned 21 last month, and her father had informed her that same day that the arrangement he had made 5 years ago would finally be honored. Montgomery Pierce, the wealthiest rancher in 3 counties, had waited long enough for his bride. Clara had been 16 when her father made the promise. The mercantile had been failing, debts piling up like storm clouds, and Pierce had offered a solution: money to save the business in exchange for Clara's hand in marriage when she came of age. Her father, desperate and grieving over her mother's declining health, had agreed. Clara remembered the day she found out, remembered her mother's tears, remembered her father unable to meet her eyes. But a promise was a promise, her father had said. A man's word was everything in this territory. She had met Montgomery Pierce exactly 4 times in those 5 years. Each meeting had confirmed her worst fears. He was 43 years old, his face carved into hard lines by years of cruelty disguised as business acumen. He owned the largest ranch within 100 miles, and everyone knew how he had acquired it through intimidation, exploitation, and rumors of worse that people were too afraid to voice aloud. He drank heavily, his breath always carrying the sour smell of whiskey, and his eyes looked at Clara like she was property he had already purchased. During their last meeting, he had grabbed her wrist hard enough to leave bruises when she had pulled away from his attempted kiss, and he had laughed at the tears that sprang to her eyes. "You will learn to be an obedient wife," he had told her, his voice cold and certain. "I do not tolerate disrespect in my household." Now those riders were coming closer, and Clara could see they were not Pierce's men. There were 5 of them, their horses lathered with sweat, and they moved with the easy confidence of men who had spent their lives in the saddle. The leader was tall, his hat pulled low, and even from a distance, Clara could see the way he carried himself spoke of capability and danger in equal measure. They pulled up in front of the saloon across the street, and the tall man dismounted with fluid grace. Clara should have gone inside. A young woman had no business staring at strange cowboys, especially not when her wedding was 3 days away. But something held her there, some instinct she could not name. The tall man looked up and down the street, his gaze sweeping past her and then returning. Even from across the dusty road, she felt the impact of his eyes meeting hers. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect, and Clara felt heat rise to her cheeks before she finally turned and fled inside. Her father was behind the counter, counting inventory with the meticulous attention he always brought to his work. Thomas Louise had aged 10 years in the last 5, his hair gone completely gray, his shoulders permanently hunched. He looked up when Clara entered, and guilt flashed across his face before he could hide it. "The seamstress will be here this afternoon for your final fitting," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Mr. Pierce wants everything to be perfect." "Of course he does," Clara said, and she could not keep the bitterness from her voice. "His property should be presented well, Clara." Her father's voice broke on her name. "Please do not make this harder than it already is." "Harder for whom?" Clara moved behind the counter, needing something to do with her hands. She began organizing the ribbon display, though it was already perfectly arranged. "You made your choice 5 years ago. You chose the mercantile over me." "I chose survival," Thomas said, and now his voice had gone hard. "For both of us. Your mother's medicine, the debts, the roof over our heads, Pierce's money saved us. This is how we repay that debt. By selling me like livestock." Clara's hands trembled as she tied a red ribbon around a spool. "Mother would be ashamed. Your mother understood necessity." Thomas closed the inventory book with more force than necessary. "She understood that in this world we do what we must to survive. Pierce is not a warm man, but he is wealthy and powerful. You will want for nothing. Except freedom. Except happiness. Except love." Clara turned to face her father fully. "Those do not matter." Thomas looked at her with eyes that held equal parts love and resignation. "Those are luxuries, daughter. This is the real world. Women marry for security. You will learn to accept it, perhaps even find contentment. Many women have." Before Clara could respond, the bell above the door chimed. She turned, expecting a regular customer, and found herself looking at the tall cowboy from across the street. Up close, he was even more striking than she had realized. He stood well over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and a lean build that spoke of hard work rather than excess. His face was sun-bronzed, with strong features and eyes the color of storm clouds. He looked to be perhaps 27 or 28, young enough that lines had not yet carved themselves permanently into his face, but old enough that he carried the weight of experience. A gun hung at his hip with the worn ease of long familiarity, but his hands were relaxed, non-threatening. "Afternoon," he said, his voice a low rumble with a slight Texas drawl. "I am hoping you might have some supplies available. My men and I have been on the trail for near 3 weeks, and we are running low on most everything." Thomas's demeanor changed immediately, becoming the accommodating merchant. Of course, of course. What do you need?" The cowboy pulled a list from his pocket, but his eyes kept drifting to Clara. She found herself unable to look away, trapped in a gaze that seemed to see more than it should. There was intelligence there, and something else. Kindness, perhaps. It had been so long since she had seen genuine kindness in a man's eyes that she had almost forgotten what it looked like. "My daughter can help you gather what you need," Thomas said, already moving toward the back room. "I need to check our stock of tobacco. Clara, please assist this gentleman." And then her father was gone, and Clara was alone with the stranger. The air seemed to thicken between them, charged with something she could not name. The cowboy handed her the list, and when their fingers brushed, Clara felt a jolt run through her entire body. "Josiah Fletcher," he said, introducing himself properly. "My friends call me Josiah. Clara Louise." She took the list, forcing herself to focus on the words written there. "You are passing through. We are delivering a herd to the railroad." Josiah moved to lean against the counter, and Clara noticed he positioned himself where he could watch both her and the door. A careful man. "Should be done in a few days, and then we will be heading back to Texas." Texas. Clara felt an absurd surge of longing for a place she had never been. Anywhere but here, she thought. Anywhere but Montgomery Pierce's ranch. She began gathering the supplies, moving through the familiar space of the mercantile with practiced efficiency. Josiah watched her work, and unlike Pierce's predatory stare, his gaze felt respectful, curious, but not presumptuous. "That is a mighty fancy dress hanging in the window," he said after a few minutes of comfortable silence. "Someone getting married." Clara's hand stilled on a bag of cornmeal. "Yes. You." The question was gentle, but it cut through her composure like a knife. She could have lied, should have lied. Instead, she met his eyes and said, "In 3 days, to a man I do not love and do not wish to marry." Josiah straightened, his entire bearing changing. "That is a hard thing to admit to a stranger. Perhaps that is why I can say it." Clara set the cornmeal on the counter with more force than necessary. "Everyone in this town knows, but no one will speak of it. My father sold me to pay his debts. Montgomery Pierce bought me like he buys cattle. And in 3 days I will become his property, and there is nothing I can do about it." "Promises can be broken," Josiah said softly. Clara laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Not in Ellsworth. Not when Montgomery Pierce is involved. He owns half this town. The sheriff works for him. The judge takes his money. If I tried to run, he would find me and bring me back, and then things would be even worse." Josiah was quiet for a long moment, his eyes never leaving her face. "I have heard of Pierce. His reputation reaches even to Texas. He is not a good man." "No," Clara agreed, her voice barely above a whisper. "He is not." The bell above the door chimed again, and Clara's heart sank as Montgomery Pierce himself walked into the mercantile. He was a large man, running to fat now but still powerful, with thinning hair and small eyes that missed nothing. He wore expensive clothes, tailored in Kansas City, and carried a walking stick with a silver handle that Clara knew concealed a blade. 2 of his ranch hands followed him in, large men with guns and mean expressions. Pierce's eyes went immediately to Clara, then to Josiah, and his expression darkened. "Who are you?" Josiah turned slowly, deliberately casual, but Clara could see the tension that had entered his frame. "Josiah Fletcher, just buying supplies before moving on. Texas by your accent." Pierce moved closer, using his bulk to intimidate. "We do not need Texas drifters in Ellsworth. Buy your supplies and get out. That is my intention." Josiah's voice remained calm, but something had hardened in his eyes. "No need for hostility. I will decide what is needed." Pierce turned to Clara, dismissing Josiah entirely. "I came to discuss the wedding preparations. Your father said the dress would be ready today. The seamstress has not arrived yet." Clara forced herself to remain still as Pierce moved closer. She could smell the whiskey on him, could see the possessiveness in his gaze. "You will make a beautiful bride." Pierce reached out and touched Clara's cheek, and she had to fight not to flinch away. "My beautiful bride, 3 more days and you will finally fulfill your father's promise." 3 days, Clara echoed, feeling the walls closing in. Pierce's hand moved from her cheek to her chin, gripping it hard enough to hurt. "I expect you to be more enthusiastic on our wedding night. You have been cold to me, Clara. That will change. I do not tolerate a cold wife." Behind Pierce, Josiah shifted, and Clara saw his hand drift closer to his gun. She caught his eye and gave the tiniest shake of her head. Pierce would kill him without a thought, and the law would declare it justified. She could not let this stranger die for her sake. Thomas Louise returned from the back room, and his face went pale when he saw Pierce. "Mr. Pierce, I did not know you were coming by today. I do not need an appointment to visit my fiancé." Pierce finally released Clara's chin, and she resisted the urge to rub the spot where his fingers had pressed. "I wanted to remind you both that I expect everything to be perfect. The ceremony will be at my ranch. The reception will last until dawn, and Clara will move into my home that same night. I have been patient long enough." "Everything will be as you wish," Thomas said, and Clara heard the defeat in her father's voice. Pierce turned back to Josiah, who was still leaning against the counter. "Are you finished here, Cowboy?" "Just about." Josiah straightened to his full height, and Clara noticed he was actually taller than Pierce by several inches. "Waiting on the lady to finish collecting my order." "The lady is occupied." Pierce's voice had gone dangerous. "Come back later or go somewhere else." For a moment, Clara thought Josiah would argue. She could see the calculation in his eyes, the weighing of options. Then he touched his hat brim in a gesture that might have been respect but felt more like mockery and said, "I will return in an hour, Miss Louise. If that suits you." "That would be fine," Clara managed. Josiah left, but not before giving Clara one more long look that seemed to convey more than words could. Then he was gone, and Clara was alone with Pierce and her father and Pierce's men, and the walls felt closer than ever. Pierce spent the next half hour going over wedding details with the obsessive control he brought to all his business dealings. The flowers had to be exact, the food had to come from his ranch, the guests had to be seated according to their importance. He spoke about Clara as though she were not there, referring to her as his property, his acquisition, his reward for patience. Thomas Louise agreed with everything, his spirit long since broken by guilt and necessity. When Pierce finally left, Clara sagged against the counter, exhausted by the effort of holding herself together. Her father looked at her with helpless misery in his eyes. "I am sorry," he whispered. "I am so sorry." But sorry was not enough to save her. Sorry would not stop the wedding. Sorry would not free her from the promise her father had made. Josiah returned exactly 1 hour later, this time alone. The mercantile was empty except for Clara, her father having retreated to the back room to lose himself in inventory. Clara had his order ready, stacked neatly on the counter. She had also included several items he had not requested, things she knew trail-weary cowboys would appreciate. Extra coffee, dried fruit, a new whetstone. Josiah noticed immediately. "You did not have to do that. Consider it a thank you for not drawing on Pierce," Clara said. "That would have been a mistake. I am aware." Josiah began examining his purchases, checking everything with the care of a man who knew how to manage supplies on a long trail. "He would have had me killed and the law would have supported him. I have seen his type before. The kind of man who uses money and fear to build a kingdom and calls it civilization. That is exactly what he has done." Clara moved to the window, looking out at the dusty street. Ellsworth was going about its business, oblivious to her despair. "And in 3 days, I will be trapped in that kingdom with no way out." Josiah was quiet for long enough that Clara turned to look at him. He was watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "What if there was a way out?" he asked. "There is not." Clara wrapped her arms around herself. "I have thought of everything. Running would only delay the inevitable. Pierce has men throughout Kansas. He would find me, and when he did, he would make sure I understood the cost of defiance. What if you had protection? What if you had men willing to stand against Pierce's thugs?" Clara felt hope flutter in her chest, fragile and painful. "Why would you do that? You do not even know me." Josiah picked up his supplies, but his eyes never left her face. "My mother was sold to pay my father's gambling debts when I was 10 years old. She was 17. The man who bought her was 45 and cruel in ways a child should never have to witness. She lasted 3 years before she took her own life rather than endure another day as his property. I swore then that if I ever had the power to prevent that fate for another woman, I would do it, no matter the cost." The raw pain in his voice broke something open inside Clara. Tears spilled down her cheeks before she could stop them. "I am sorry. I am so sorry about your mother. So am I." Josiah set the supplies down and moved closer, though he kept a respectful distance. "But her death can have meaning if it saves you, if it stops Pierce from destroying another life." "He will kill you," Clara said desperately. "He will kill you and anyone who helps you. He can try." There was steel in Josiah's voice now, the tone of a man who had faced death before and survived. "I have 4 good men with me. We have fought rustlers, outlaws, and Comanche raiders. We are not afraid of one corrupt rancher and his hired thugs." "It is not just his men," Clara said. "The whole town is in his pocket. The sheriff, the judge, the mayor. If you try to help me, you will be declared outlaws. You will have to run for the rest of your lives." "Then we run." Josiah took another step closer, and now Clara could see the gray flecks in his storm-colored eyes, could see the old scar that traced his left cheekbone. "Miss Louise, I am not saying this will be easy. I am not saying there will not be consequences, but I am saying that you have a choice. Promises can be broken. Debts can be defaulted. You do not have to marry Montgomery Pierce." Clara wanted to believe him, wanted it with a desperation that terrified her. But she had spent 5 years learning to accept her fate, 5 years pushing down hope because hope was more painful than resignation. "I need to think," she said finally. "This is not a decision I can make in a moment." Josiah nodded slowly. "Fair enough. My men and I are camped outside of town, about 2 miles west along the creek. The old cottonwood grove. If you decide you want freedom more than you fear the cost, come find us. We will be there for 2 more days before we need to move the herd. After that, I cannot promise anything." He paid for his supplies, including the extra items Clara had added, though she tried to wave away the money. Then he gathered everything and headed for the door. He paused on the threshold, looking back at her one more time. "You deserve better than Pierce," he said simply. "You deserve a life, not a sentence. Think about that." Then he was gone, and Clara was alone with the most dangerous thing in the world, hope. The rest of the day passed in a blur. The seamstress came and made the final adjustments to the wedding dress, chattering about how lucky Clara was to be marrying such a wealthy man. Clara said nothing, standing still as a statue while pins were adjusted and hems were measured. Her father watched from the corner, his face gray with guilt and resignation. When the seamstress finally left, Clara went upstairs to her small room and sat on her bed, staring at nothing. She could run. For the first time in 5 years, she actually had an option. Josiah Fletcher was offering her a way out, offering to face Montgomery Pierce's wrath on her behalf. It was insane. It was impossible. It was exactly what she wanted, but the cost. The cost would be enormous. Pierce would send his men after them. They would be hunted across Kansas, maybe into other territories. Josiah and his men would be risking their lives, their freedom, their futures. And for what? For a woman they did not know, for a principle that most men in 1876 Kansas would laugh at. Women were married off to settle debts all the time. It was accepted, expected even. Who was she to demand more? But then she thought of Pierce's hands on her, his breath in her face, his cold eyes looking at her like property. She thought of spending every day for the rest of her life trapped in his house, bearing his children, submitting to his cruelty. She thought of her mother, who had wept when she learned of the arrangement but had been too weak with consumption to fight it. She thought of becoming like the other women in Pierce's orbit, dead-eyed and defeated, their spirits broken by years of abuse disguised as marriage. And she thought of Josiah Fletcher, a stranger who had looked at her with respect and offered her something no one else had, a choice. Clara stood up and moved to her window. The sun was setting over Ellsworth, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Somewhere out there, 2 miles west along the creek, Josiah and his men were making camp. Waiting to see if she had the courage to choose freedom over security, hope over resignation. She spent the night planning. It had to be careful, had to be smart. Pierce had men watching the mercantile, though they tried to be subtle about it. If she just walked out of town, they would follow. She would have to be clever, and she would have to be brave. The next morning, Clara told her father she wanted to visit her mother's grave one last time before the wedding. Thomas looked relieved, probably grateful she was showing some sentiment that indicated acceptance. He agreed immediately, even offered to accompany her, but Clara insisted she wanted to go alone. It took some convincing, but eventually he relented. A daughter visiting her mother's grave was respectable, understandable. Even Pierce's watchers would not find that suspicious. The cemetery was on the west side of town, conveniently in the direction of the cottonwood grove. Clara wore her riding clothes and carried a small bag she claimed held flowers for her mother's grave. In reality, it held everything she owned that mattered: her mother's jewelry, her own saved money, a change of clothes, and a few precious photographs. Not much to show for 21 years of life, but it was hers. She visited her mother's grave first, needing the moment to gather her courage. The headstone was simple: Clara Louise, beloved wife and mother, 1835–1874. Clara knelt in the dirt and placed her hand on the carved letters. "I am sorry, Mama," she whispered. "I am sorry I could not save you, but maybe I can save myself. Maybe that is enough." The wind rustled through the grass, and Clara chose to believe it was her mother's blessing. She left the cemetery at a walk, heading west as though simply taking a longer route home. Pierce's men were watching from a distance. She could see them trying to look casual near the edge of town. But she was just walking, just a woman stretching her legs before being confined to wedding preparations. Nothing suspicious, nothing worth investigating. Once she was out of sight of town, Clara began to run. Her riding boots were not designed for running, and her skirts tangled around her legs, but terror and hope gave her speed. She followed the creek, crashing through underbrush, her breath coming in gasps. 2 miles had never seemed so far. Every sound made her think Pierce's men had discovered her escape, that they were coming after her, that her bid for freedom was already over. Then she saw the cottonwood grove, and the camp smoke rising through the trees, and Josiah Fletcher standing watch at the edge of the clearing. He saw her running and immediately moved toward her, covering the distance with long strides. "You came," he said, and there was relief in his voice that matched her own. "I came," Clara gasped, clutching her bag like a lifeline. "But they will realize soon. Pierce has men watching me. When I do not return, they will come looking. Then we move now." Josiah took her bag and began leading her into the camp. 4 other men were already breaking down tents and loading horses, moving with the practiced efficiency of men used to quick departures. "These are my men: Sam, Daniel, Robert, and Marcus. Good men, all of them. They know the situation and have agreed to help." The 4 cowboys tipped their hats to Clara, and she saw no judgment in their faces, only determination. They were all young, probably in their 20s, weathered by trail work but not yet hardened by too many years. They looked at Josiah with respect bordering on reverence, and Clara understood that he had led them through difficult times before. "Can you ride?" Josiah asked, and Clara nodded. Her father had taught her when she was young, before her mother's illness had consumed all their resources and attention. She had not ridden in years, but some skills stayed with you. Josiah helped her onto a horse, a steady mare with kind eyes. Then he swung up onto his own mount, a large roan gelding that clearly knew its rider well. The other men were already mounted, their rifles ready though not yet drawn. They had abandoned the herd, Clara realized. Whatever cattle they had been driving were left behind. They had given up their job, their pay, their purpose just to help her. "Why?" she asked Josiah as they began to move. "Why would you all risk so much for me?" Josiah looked at her, and in the morning light his eyes were more silver than gray. "Because it is the right thing to do." Because every man here has seen women treated as property and hated it. Because you asked for help and we could give it. That is reason enough." They rode hard, pushing the horses as fast as they dared. Josiah led them northwest, away from the main trails, into rougher country where Pierce's men would have trouble following with large numbers. They crossed streams to hide their tracks, cut through rocky areas that would not hold hoof prints, doubled back and circled around to confuse anyone trying to trail them. By mid-afternoon, Clara was exhausted, her legs aching from gripping the saddle, her hands raw from clutching the reins. But she did not complain. Every mile between her and Montgomery Pierce was a victory, a reclamation of her own life. She watched Josiah ride ahead, his posture easy despite the pace, his attention constantly scanning their surroundings. He was protecting her, this stranger. He was risking everything to keep his promise. They made camp that night in a narrow canyon, defensible and hidden. Sam, who seemed to be second in command, took first watch while the others built a small fire and prepared food. Clara sat on a rock, trying to process everything that had happened. This morning, she had been 3 days away from becoming Mrs. Montgomery Pierce. Now she was a fugitive, running across Kansas with 5 cowboys who barely knew her. Josiah brought her coffee and a plate of beans and hardtack. It was trail food, rough and simple, but Clara thought it tasted better than any meal she had ever eaten. It tasted like freedom. "How are you holding up?" Josiah asked, settling beside her with his own plate. "I keep thinking I will wake up," Clara admitted. "That this cannot be real. That I cannot have actually done this." "You did." Josiah sipped his coffee, his eyes on the fire. "You chose freedom, that takes courage, or insanity." Clara laughed, but it was edged with hysteria. "Do you know what Pierce will do when he catches us? If he catches us, he will not catch us." Josiah's voice was absolute. "I promise you that." "You cannot promise that." Clara set down her plate, her appetite gone. "He has resources, men, influence. We are 6 people on tired horses running through country he knows better than we do. The odds are not in our favor." "The odds are never in favor of the righteous," Josiah said. "That has never stopped people from doing what is right. My mother had no one to help her, but you do. That has to count for something." Clara looked at him, really looked at him. He was young, probably only a few years older than her, but he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had already lived a full life. There were scars on his hands, a faded brand mark on his forearm that spoke of time as a ranch hand, lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun. He was handsome, she realized, in a rough-hewn way that had nothing to do with carefully tailored clothes or expensive grooming. He was handsome like the land was beautiful, stark, honest, uncompromising. "Tell me about your mother," she said softly, "if that is not too painful." Josiah was quiet for a long time, and Clara thought he might refuse. Then he began to speak, his voice low and controlled. "Her name was Mary. She was 16 when she married my father, 17 when I was born. My father was not a bad man, just a weak one. He loved gambling more than he loved us, and eventually it destroyed him. He lost everything, including his self-respect. When the debts got too high, a man named Walter Crenshaw offered to clear them in exchange for my mother. My father agreed." Josiah's hands tightened around his coffee cup. "I do not think he understood what he was doing, or maybe he did and just did not care. Either way, my mother became Crenshaw's property. I watched her spirit break piece by piece over 3 years. He beat her, used her, destroyed everything beautiful about her. When I was 13, I came home from work and found her in the barn. She had hanged herself." "Oh, Josiah." Clara reached out without thinking, placing her hand over his. He did not pull away. "I left that night. Took a horse, a gun, and what food I could carry. I have been on my own ever since, working ranches, driving cattle, doing whatever needed doing. I swore I would never let money or fear make me into my father. I swore I would never stand by while someone with power crushed someone without it. That is why I am here. That is why we are all here." Clara felt tears running down her face. "I am sorry. I am so sorry for what happened to her, for what you lost. So am I." Josiah finally looked at her, and his eyes held a depth of pain that made Clara's heart ache. "But maybe her death can stop your death, even if it is just the death of your spirit. Maybe that is the meaning I have been looking for." They sat in silence for a while, hands still touching, the fire crackling between them. Around them, the other men quietly prepared for the night, their movements respectful of the moment. Clara felt something shifting inside her, something that had been frozen for 5 years beginning to thaw. It was not just gratitude she felt for Josiah Fletcher. It was something deeper, more complicated, something that felt dangerously like the beginning of love. The next 2 days were brutal. They pushed hard, sleeping little, always moving. Twice they saw riders in the distance and had to hide, pressing themselves and their horses into ravines or behind rock formations, waiting breathlessly for the danger to pass. Pierce's men were searching, casting a wide net, but Josiah's careful trail craft kept them ahead of the pursuit. On the 3rd day they crossed into Colorado territory. It was not safety exactly, but it was distance. Pierce's influence was strongest in Kansas. Out here, his money bought less loyalty, his threats carried less weight. They were still hunted, still in danger, but the odds had shifted slightly in their favor. That night, they made camp near a small stream, and for the first time, Josiah allowed them a fire large enough to actually provide warmth. The temperature had dropped as they climbed into higher country, and Clara was grateful for the heat. She sat close to the flames, wrapped in a blanket one of the men had given her, and watched Josiah move around the camp. He was always working, always checking, always making sure his men and Clara were safe and comfortable before seeing to his own needs. It was leadership, Clara realized. Quiet, unassuming, but absolutely effective. When he finally settled beside her, she said, "You would have been married by now." "If I had stayed, the wedding would have been today." Josiah nodded slowly. "Are you having regrets?" "No," Clara surprised herself with how certain she sounded. "No regrets. I am terrified, exhausted, and uncertain about the future, but I am not sorry. For the first time in 5 years, I feel like my life belongs to me again." "Good." Josiah fed another branch into the fire. "That is how it should be." "What happens now?" Clara asked. "We cannot run forever." "No," Josiah agreed. "We need a plan. I was thinking we could head to Denver. It is a growing city, lots of people, easy to disappear. I have friends there who might help. Once we are settled, we can decide what comes next." Clara looked at him. "You do not have to keep helping me. You have already done more than anyone could expect. You and your men should go back to Texas, to your lives. I can manage from here." Josiah turned to face her fully, and the look in his eyes made Clara's breath catch. "Do you want me to leave?" It was a simple question, but it held so much weight. Clara knew the right answer, the sensible answer. She should tell him to go, to save himself and his men from further danger. She should insist on managing alone, on not being a burden. But when she opened her mouth, different words came out. "No," she whispered. "I do not want you to leave." "Then I am staying." Josiah reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle. "Clara, I need to be honest with you. When I first saw you on that porch in Ellsworth, I felt something I have not felt in a long time. Maybe ever. I told myself I was helping you because of my mother, because of principle. And that is true, but it is not the whole truth." Clara's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "What is the whole truth?" The whole truth is that I am falling in love with you, Josiah said simply. I know that is probably too fast, too soon. I know we barely know each other, but it is the truth nonetheless. You are brave and strong and beautiful, and I want to know everything about you. I want to protect you, yes, but I also want to be with you, if you will have me. Clara felt tears welling up again, but this time they were not from sadness. I feel it too, this thing between us. I have been trying not to name it because it seems impossible. How can you fall in love with someone in just a few days? I do not know, Josiah said, and now he was smiling, a real smile that transformed his entire face. But I think sometimes your heart knows things your mind has not figured out yet. I think sometimes you meet someone and everything just clicks into place. I think that is what happened with us. This is insane, Clara said, but she was smiling too. A week ago, I was preparing to marry a man I hated. Now I am on the run with a man I barely know, and I think I am falling in love with him. My life has become a dime novel. Is that a bad thing? Josiah leaned closer, and Clara could feel the warmth radiating from him. No, she said softly. It is the best thing that has ever happened to me. When Josiah kissed her, it was nothing like the rough, possessive attempts Pierce had made. This was gentle, questioning, a request rather than a demand. Clara melted into it, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling his heart beating as fast as her own. The kiss deepened, and she felt something break open inside her, something that had been locked away for so long she had forgotten it existed. Joy. Pure, uncomplicated joy. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Josiah rested his forehead against hers. I promise I will keep you safe, he murmured. I promise Pierce will never touch you again. And I promise that whatever future we build together will be based on choice, not obligation. On love, not fear. Those are big promises, Clara said. Promises can be broken, Josiah replied, echoing his words from that first day. But I do not intend to break these. They spent the rest of the night talking, learning each other's stories. Josiah told her about growing up on the trail, about the men he had worked with and the places he had seen. He told her about Texas, about the ranch where he had spent the last 3 years, about his dreams of someday owning his own land. Clara told him about Ellsworth, about her mother's slow decline, about her father's guilt and her own helplessness. She told him about her love of reading, about the books she had devoured in the mercantile's quiet moments, about her dreams of seeing places she had only read about. The other men gave them privacy, settling into their bedrolls early or taking watch positions far from the fire. Clara was grateful for their discretion, for the way they had accepted her without question. These were good men, she realized, men who valued loyalty and principle over easy money. Men who followed Josiah because they believed in him. Over the next week, they made their way steadily toward Denver. The journey was hard, the country rough, but Clara found she did not mind. Every day felt like a gift, a stolen moment of freedom she had never expected to have. She grew more comfortable on her horse, more skilled at trail life. She learned to make coffee over an open fire, to read the weather in the clouds, to move quietly through underbrush. The men taught her, patient and encouraging, treating her as a companion rather than a burden. And every night she and Josiah would find time to be together. Sometimes they talked for hours. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence. And sometimes they would kiss, exploring this new thing between them with careful wonder. Josiah was always respectful, always mindful of boundaries, but Clara could feel the desire between them growing. It was not the cold, frightening possession Pierce had promised. It was warm and mutual and right. They were 5 days from Denver when everything went wrong. They had stopped to water the horses at a creek, thinking they were alone. The attack came without warning. A dozen riders burst from the trees, led by a man Clara recognized from Pierce's ranch. They had been found. Josiah reacted instantly, shoving Clara toward cover while drawing his gun. His men were equally fast, taking defensive positions behind rocks and trees. Shots rang out, the sound deafening in the quiet morning. Clara pressed herself into a small hollow, her heart pounding with terror, watching as Josiah and his men fought for their lives. For her life. The battle was brief but brutal. Pierce's men had numbers, but Josiah's men had skill and desperation. Bullets whined through the air, kicking up dirt and splintering trees. Clara saw Marcus take a hit to his arm, saw blood bloom on his shirt, but he kept firing. Sam shot a man off his horse, then another. Josiah was everywhere, his gun blazing, his voice shouting orders, keeping his men coordinated. Then Clara saw the rider circling around, flanking their position, his gun aimed at Josiah's unprotected back. Without thinking, she grabbed a rock and threw it, screaming a warning. The rock struck the rider's horse, spooking it, ruining his aim. His shot went wide, and Josiah spun and returned fire in one smooth motion. The man fell, but the distraction had given Pierce's remaining men time to regroup. They charged forward, clearly intending to take Clara alive. Josiah and his men met them head-on, and suddenly it was not a gunfight but a melee. Clara saw Josiah grappling with a large man, saw them fall to the ground, fighting for control of a gun. Terror gave her strength. She grabbed a fallen branch and ran forward, bringing it down on the man's head with all her might. He collapsed, and Josiah was able to break free. "Get back to cover," Josiah shouted at her, but Clara shook her head. "I am not hiding while you all die for me," she shouted back. There was no time for argument. The fight continued, desperate and chaotic. But Pierce's men were breaking, their leader down, their numbers thinned. The survivors finally fled, riding hard back the way they had come, leaving their dead and wounded behind. In the sudden silence, Clara stood shaking, the branch still in her hands, unable to believe they had survived. Josiah was at her side in an instant, pulling her into his arms. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his hands running over her, checking for injuries. No, I am fine." Clara clung to him, feeling his heart racing. "Are you?" "I am fine." Josiah pulled back enough to look at her, and his expression was torn between relief and anger. "But you should not have jumped into the fight like that. You could have been killed." "So could you?" Clara shot back. "You were all fighting for me. How could I hide and do nothing? Because keeping you safe is the whole point." Josiah's voice rose, stress and fear making him sharp. "If you die, then all of this means nothing. And if you die, then my safety means nothing." Clara was shouting now too. "Do you understand that? You are not just my protector, Josiah. You are the man I love. I would rather die fighting beside you than live knowing I hid while you were killed." Josiah stared at her, and suddenly his expression changed. "You love me." Clara realized what she had said. Yes, I love you. I know it is fast and crazy and probably foolish, but I love you." Josiah kissed her hard, right there in the middle of the battlefield, with his men watching and dead bodies scattered around them. It was not romantic by any conventional measure, but to Clara, it was perfect. It was real and raw and honest. "I love you too," Josiah said against her lips. "God help me, I love you too." They buried Pierce's dead, not out of respect, but because it was the right thing to do. Marcus's arm wound was cleaned and bandaged. It was not deep, the bullet had grazed rather than penetrated, but it would slow him down. They needed to move quickly now. Pierce would know they were in Colorado, would send more men, but they also knew something Pierce did not. They had won. They had faced his hunters and survived. They had fought together and prevailed. That changed the equation. "We need to get to Denver," Josiah said as they rode. "But we also need to consider something else. Pierce is not going to stop. He will keep sending men, keep hunting you until either we are dead or he is." "What are you suggesting?" Clara asked, though she thought she knew. "I am suggesting we stop running." Josiah's jaw was set in a determined line. "I am suggesting we find a way to end this permanently, make it so Pierce cannot threaten you anymore." "How?" Sam asked. "The law is on his side." "Maybe the law in Kansas," Josiah said, "but we are in Colorado now. Different jurisdiction, different authorities. If we can get evidence of Pierce's crimes, real evidence, we might be able to bring charges against him. Make him the hunted instead of the hunter." It was a dangerous plan. It would mean going back, getting close to Pierce's operation, risking capture. But Clara found herself nodding. She was tired of running, tired of looking over her shoulder. If there was a way to end this, she wanted to take it. They spent another week making careful inquiries, talking to people who had been hurt by Pierce's business practices, gathering stories and grudges. Turned out Montgomery Pierce had made a lot of enemies over the years. Ranchers he had cheated, workers he had abused, women he had mistreated. The problem was getting anyone to testify. Pierce's reach was long, his reputation for vengeance well established. Then they caught a break. A former foreman of Pierce's, a man named Henry Watkins, had been fired 6 months ago for refusing to participate in what he called illegal activities. He had left Kansas and settled in Colorado, thinking he was far enough away to be safe. When Josiah and Clara found him, he was working at a small ranch outside of Denver, trying to rebuild his life. Watkins listened to their story with growing interest. "Pierce is a criminal," he said flatly. "I worked for him 5 years and saw things that would curl your hair. Cattle rustling, land fraud, intimidation, assault. He has bribed judges, threatened sheriffs, and ruined lives. But he covers his tracks well, and people are too scared to stand against him. What if they were not alone?" Josiah asked. "What if there was a case building with multiple witnesses with evidence?" Watkins considered. "There is a federal marshal in Denver, name of Charles Patterson. He is clean, which is rare out here. He has been trying to build a case against Pierce for a while now, but has not had enough to make it stick. If you could bring him what he needs, he might be able to act." It took 2 more weeks of careful work, but eventually they had it. 3 other witnesses besides Watkins, all willing to testify. Documentation of fraudulent land deals. Proof of cattle rustling across state lines, which made it a federal crime. And Clara's own testimony about the arrangement her father had made, which might not be illegal in itself, but painted a picture of Pierce's character. Marshal Patterson was a serious man in his 50s, with steel gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He listened to everything they had, asked probing questions, and finally nodded. "This is enough," he said. "I can bring charges, federal charges, which means Kansas authorities cannot protect him. But I have to warn you, this will not be quick or easy. Pierce has money for lawyers. He will fight. And even if we win, there will be retaliation. Men like Pierce do not go down quietly." "I know," Clara said, "but I would rather fight than spend the rest of my life afraid." Patterson issued a warrant for Pierce's arrest on federal charges. It took another 2 weeks to coordinate with authorities and make the arrest happen. Josiah and Clara waited in Denver, staying with friends of Josiah's, trying to build something like a normal life while they waited for news. It was during this time that their relationship deepened into something permanent. They were no longer strangers thrown together by circumstance. They were partners, building a future together. Josiah found work at a ranch outside of Denver, and Clara got a job at a bookstore in town. They rented a small house, nothing fancy, but it was theirs. Theirs by choice, not obligation. And one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold, Josiah took Clara's hand. "Marry me," he said simply. Clara turned to look at him, her heart full. "Are you sure? We have only known each other a few months. People will think we are crazy." "I am sure," Josiah said. "I was sure the first day I met you. I am sure every day I wake up and see your face. I am sure when we work together, laugh together, plan together. I love you, Clara Louise. I want to spend the rest of my life with you, not because of a promise or a debt or fear, because of choice, because of love." Tears ran down Clara's face as she nodded. "Yes, yes, I will marry you, Josiah Fletcher. I love you so much it scares me sometimes, but it is a good kind of fear. The kind that means something matters." They were married a week later in a simple ceremony with Josiah's men as witnesses. Clara wore a dress she had bought with her own money, not an expensive creation but one she had chosen herself. Josiah wore his best clothes, which were not very different from his everyday clothes but were clean and pressed. The preacher said the words, and Clara said, "I do," with absolute certainty. And when Josiah kissed her as his wife, she felt like her life was finally, truly beginning. The news about Pierce came a month after their wedding. He had been arrested attempting to flee to Mexico. The evidence against him was overwhelming, and his expensive lawyers could not make it disappear. He was convicted on multiple federal charges and sentenced to 15 years in prison. His ranch was seized to pay debts and fines. His empire crumbled as quickly as it had been built. Clara's father sent a letter finally. In it, he apologized, inadequately but sincerely. He understood if Clara could never forgive him. He was selling the mercantile and moving east to St. Louis to start over where people did not know his shame. He hoped Clara had found happiness. He hoped someday she might write to him. Clara read the letter 3 times before deciding what to do. In the end, she wrote back. Not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement. Her father had been weak, but he had not been malicious. He had made a terrible choice born of fear and desperation. Clara was learning that people were complicated, that right and wrong were not always clear-cut. She told him about Josiah, about their marriage, about their life in Colorado. She did not invite him to visit, but she left the possibility open that someday she might. The years that followed were not perfect, but they were good. Josiah continued working as a ranch hand, eventually saving enough to buy a small piece of land where they started their own ranch. It was hard work, brutal sometimes, but it was theirs. They built it together, equal partners in every way. Clara kept working at the bookstore even after they no longer needed the money because she loved it. She loved being surrounded by stories, by possibilities, by worlds different from her own. She began writing too, composing stories about the West, about strong women and honorable men, about the possibility of choosing your own fate. Their first child was born 2 years after their wedding. A boy, healthy and loud and perfect. They named him Thomas, after Clara's father, a gesture of reconciliation that made the old man weep when he received the letter. He came to visit when Thomas was 6 months old, and Clara found that enough time had passed that she could look at him without anger. Not complete forgiveness, but something close to peace. Their second child, a daughter they named Mary after Josiah's mother, was born 2 years after Thomas. She had her father's gray eyes and her mother's determination, and from the moment she was born, she ruled the household with an iron will disguised as charm. The years passed in the way years do, marked by small moments and large ones, by triumphs and struggles, by the ordinary magic of building a life with someone you love. Josiah's men, who had become his brothers in every way that mattered, settled nearby. Sam married a schoolteacher from Denver. Daniel found work as a deputy marshal. Robert bought a saloon in town and ran it with cheerful efficiency. Marcus became Josiah's partner in the ranch, his arm fully healed, his loyalty never wavering. They built a community, these people who had come together through circumstance and stayed together through choice. They celebrated births and mourned deaths. They helped each other through hard winters and droughts. They became the kind of family that was not based on blood but on something deeper. Shared experience, mutual respect, and love freely given. Clara never forgot Montgomery Pierce, but he became less a monster and more a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when people treat each other as property rather than partners. She heard he died in prison after serving only 7 years, his health destroyed by the harsh conditions. She felt neither joy nor sorrow at the news, only a distant relief that he could hurt no one else. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and the ranch work was done, Clara and Josiah would sit on their porch and watch the sun set over the mountains. They would hold hands, comfortable in the silence that comes from truly knowing another person. And Clara would think about that day in Ellsworth, when a tall cowboy had walked into her father's mercantile and offered her something no one else had, a choice. "You ever regret it?" Josiah asked one evening as though reading her mind. "Everything you gave up, everything you went through." Clara looked at him, at the gray in his hair that had not been there when they met, at the lines around his eyes that deepened when he smiled, at the strong, capable hands that had worked so hard to build their life. She looked out at their land, at the house they had built, at the barn where their children played. She thought about the years behind them and the years ahead, about the love that had grown from a desperate escape into something deep and enduring. "Not for a single moment," she said, and meant it with everything in her heart. They had 3 more children over the years, each one a blessing and a challenge. The ranch prospered, becoming known throughout Colorado for the quality of their horses. Clara's stories were published in magazines back east, bringing in extra money and a certain amount of fame that still surprised her. Their children grew strong and independent, raised with the understanding that their lives were their own to shape. Thomas became a lawyer, drawn by his mother's stories of Marshall Patterson and the power of justice properly applied. He specialized in defending those who could not afford proper representation, carrying on the family tradition of standing against those who would abuse power. Mary became a rancher like her father, taking over more and more of the operation as Josiah's back and knees began to protest the hard work. The other 3 children each found their own paths. One became a teacher, one a doctor, and one a writer like his mother. Clara's father lived another 15 years after reconciling with his daughter. He never remarried, as though determined to spend his remaining years making amends for his earlier weakness. He visited once a year, bringing presents for his grandchildren and a gratitude for Clara's forgiveness that never quite faded. When he died, Clara wept, but they were cleansing tears, the final release of old pain. Josiah's ranch hands, those 4 men who had risked everything to help a woman they did not know, remained close friends throughout their lives. They were Thomas's godfathers, Mary's honorary uncles, fixtures at every family gathering. Their children grew up together, creating bonds that lasted generations. When they grew old, they would sit around fires and tell stories about the time they helped a young woman escape a cruel fate, and the story grew in the telling until it became legend. But the truth was simpler and more profound than any legend. A woman had needed help. Men had chosen to give it. Love had grown in the space created by courage and compassion. And from that beginning, an entire life had been built. On their 30th wedding anniversary, Josiah and Clara took a trip back to Kansas. They had not been back since that desperate flight so many years ago, and Clara was not entirely sure why she wanted to return. But something called her, some need to see where it all started. Ellsworth had changed. It was smaller now, the cattle trade having moved elsewhere, the rough edges worn smooth by time and civilization. The mercantile where Clara had grown up was a restaurant now. The saloon where Josiah had first stopped was a church. The whole town felt like a relic, a reminder of a wilder time. They walked the streets hand in hand, both in their 50s now, their bodies marked by years of hard work but their spirits still strong. They found the cemetery where Clara's mother was buried, the headstone weathered but still readable. Clara placed flowers and stood in silence, thinking about the woman who had wept when learning her daughter's fate, who had not lived to see her daughter's escape and triumph. "Thank you, Mama," Clara whispered. "Thank you for loving me enough to want better for me, even if you could not make it happen. I hope you know I found it. I hope you are proud." They found the creek where Clara had run that morning so long ago, desperate and terrified and full of hope. It looked smaller now, less formidable, but Clara remembered how endless it had seemed, how every step had felt like a declaration of independence. "I was so scared," she said softly. "I kept thinking I would be caught, brought back, punished for daring to want more than what had been decided for me." "But you did it anyway," Josiah said, his arm around her shoulders. "You chose courage over fear. You chose life over resignation. That is no small thing." "I had help," Clara reminded him. "I had you." "We had each other," Josiah corrected. "That is how it works. We help each other. We save each other. We build something together that neither of us could have built alone." They stayed in Kansas for a week, exploring old places and making new memories. They discovered that people still talked about what had happened, about the young woman who had run away from Montgomery Pierce and the cowboy who had helped her. The story had taken on a life of its own, changing and evolving with each telling, but the core remained the same. Promises could be broken when they were unjust, and love was worth fighting for. On their last day, they rode out to where Pierce's ranch had been. It was broken up now, sold in parcels, the grand house fallen into ruin. Nature was reclaiming it, vines growing through windows, the roof caving in, the whole structure returning to the earth. There was something satisfying about seeing the physical manifestation of Pierce's empire reduced to rubble and rot. "He was so powerful," Clara said, looking at the ruins. "He controlled so much, hurt so many, and now there is almost nothing left of him. Just a cautionary tale and a ruined building." "That is the thing about power built on cruelty," Josiah said. "It does not last. It cannot. True strength comes from love, from community, from treating people with dignity and respect. That endures." They returned to Colorado and their ranch, to their children and grandchildren, to the life they had built together. And Clara realized that she had gotten everything she had ever wanted, not through magic or luck, but through courage and choice and the love of a good man who had believed her life was worth saving. The years continued their steady march. Josiah and Clara grew old together, their bodies slowing but their minds and hearts remaining sharp. They watched their children have children of their own, watched their ranch pass to the next generation, watched the world change around them. Colorado became a state. The railroad expanded. The Old West began to fade into history, replaced by something more settled and civilized. But some things remained constant. Love, for instance. The deep, abiding love between two people who had chosen each other against all odds. That never faded, never diminished. If anything, it grew stronger with each passing year, each shared experience, each moment of joy and sorrow weathered together. When Josiah was 72 and Clara was 69, They sat on their porch one summer evening, watching their youngest grandchild chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. The air was warm and sweet, filled with the scent of hay and horses and growing things. Somewhere in the house, their children and grandchildren were laughing, preparing dinner, living their lives with the freedom and confidence that came from being raised by people who understood the value of choice. "I would do it all again," Josiah said suddenly. "Every moment, every hardship, every fight. I would choose you every time, Clara. In every life, in every world, I would choose you." Clara turned to look at her husband, this man who had ridden into her life when she needed saving and had stayed because they had saved each other. His hair was white now, his face carved with wrinkles, his hands gnarled from decades of hard work. He was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. "And I would choose you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Every time, without hesitation. You gave me my life back, Josiah. And then you shared yours with me. That is the greatest gift I have ever received." They kissed then, a soft, gentle kiss that held 30-plus years of love and partnership and mutual respect. The fireflies danced around them, and inside the house their family carried on, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to the rising moon. It was an ordinary moment, and it was perfect. Josiah lived another 3 years after that evening, dying peacefully in his sleep at 75 with Clara holding his hand. At his funeral, the church was packed with people whose lives he had touched. Cowboys he had worked with, families he had helped, children he had taught to ride, friends who had known his kindness and courage. The preacher spoke of his character, his integrity, his devotion to his family. But Clara knew the true measure of the man. He had seen someone in need and had chosen to help, even at great personal cost. He had believed that promises could be broken when they were unjust, and he had been willing to fight for that belief. Clara lived another 7 years after Josiah's death. She spent those years surrounded by family, writing her memoirs, teaching her grandchildren about courage and choice and love. She told them the story of how their grandfather had ridden into Ellsworth, Kansas in 1876, and had offered her a choice that changed everything. She told them about the flight across Kansas and into Colorado, about the battle by the creek, about building a ranch and a life from nothing but determination and love. She told them that the world would always have people like Montgomery Pierce, people who saw others as property to be owned and controlled. But the world also had people like Josiah Fletcher, people who believed in dignity and choice, and the fundamental right of every person to determine their own fate. She told them to be like Josiah, to stand up for those who could not stand up for themselves, to fight for justice even when it was hard, to choose love over fear every single time. When Clara died at 76, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, her last words were simple. "Tell him I am coming. Tell Josiah I will find him, wherever he is." She was buried next to Josiah on a hill overlooking their ranch, the two of them together even in death. The headstones were simple, listing names and dates, but they did not need elaborate words. Their lives had been the testament, the proof that courage and love could overcome fear and cruelty. That promises could be broken when they needed to be, that choosing your own fate was worth any cost. The ranch stayed in the family for generations, each new owner adding their own chapter to the story. The house was expanded, the land was developed, the operation modernized. But in the front room above the fireplace hung a painting of Josiah and Clara on their wedding day, young and hopeful and deeply in love. And every child born into the family learned the story, the legend that had started their legacy. A woman promised to a cruel man. A cowboy who rode in and said promises could be broken. And the love that had bloomed from that moment of courage, growing into something that lasted beyond lifetimes, beyond memory, beyond death itself. Because that was the truth that Josiah and Clara had discovered and lived every day of their lives together. Real love, the kind built on mutual respect and shared choice, was stronger than any promise made in fear. It was stronger than money or power or social expectation. It was the force that could reshape worlds, rewrite destinies, and prove that every person, no matter their circumstances, had the right to choose their own fate. And that truth, more than any cattle or land or money, was the real inheritance they left behind. Not just to their children and grandchildren, but to everyone who heard their story and recognized in it the possibility of their own transformation. The possibility of breaking unjust promises. The possibility of choosing love over fear. The possibility of riding in, like Josiah had done so many years ago, and offering someone the most precious gift of all, freedom. That was the legacy. That was the story. And it lived on long after both of them had passed into legend, inspiring new generations to stand up, speak out, and fight for the fundamental truth that every human being deserved dignity, choice, and the chance to build a life based on love rather than obligation. The ranch still stood, a century and a half later, a monument to what two people had built together when they chose courage over fear and love over resignation. And on summer evenings, when the fireflies danced and the air was warm and sweet, people swore they could sometimes see two figures on the porch, holding hands and watching the sunset together, eternal in their love and the choices that had made it possible.